Why being a knight was mostly boring and sometimes fatal. Hey, everyone, welcome back to another journey through the not-so-glamorous corridors of history. Tonight, we're trading Hollywood's shining armor and heroic quests for the reality of medieval knighthood, where glory was rare, boredom was constant, and death could come from something as mundane as an infected splinter. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1347. You're somewhere in the English countryside, and you're waking up to what might charitably be called the nightlife. But before you get too excited about quests and courtly romance, let me paint you the actual picture of your morning. You crack open your eyes in what passes for your chamber. A stone room roughly the size of a modern walk-in closet with walls that weep moisture and a single window that's essentially a rectangular hole in the wall. There's no glass, just wooden shutters that rattle like chattering teeth whenever the wind picks up, which in medieval England is essentially always. Your bed is a wooden frame strung with rope topped with a straw mattress that's seen better centuries. The straw crackles under your weight like autumn leaves, and you're fairly certain something with too many legs just scurried across your ankle. The bedding consists of rough woolen blankets that smell like wet sheep, which incidentally, they probably were until very recently. You swing your legs over the side of the bed, and immediately your feet meet the stone floor, which has all the warmth and comfort of a medieval refrigerator. The cold shoots up through your body like nature's own alarm clock, one that can't be snoozed and definitely can't be turned off. The air in your chamber carries that special medieval bouquet, a delicate blend of wood smoke, human funk, horse manure from the courtyard below, and that indefinable mustiness that comes from living in a building where damp is not a problem to be solved, but simply a fact of life to be endured. You stumble towards your window and peer out at the castle courtyard. Already the place is buzzing with activity. Servants scurry about like medieval worker ants, their breath visible in the morning air. The stable boys are mucking out stalls, which explains the aromatic symphony wafting up to your chamber. Kitchen staff are hauling water from the well, their wooden buckets creaking with each step. And there in the distance, you can see your fellow knights emerging from their own stone boxes, looking about as enthusiastic about the day ahead as you feel. Some are stretching, others are scratching at flea bites, and more than a few are examining various body parts with the kind of concern that suggests yesterday's training session left its mark. This is your reality as a knight in 1347 England. No golden sunrise illuminating your noble quest, no stirring trumpet fanfares, just cold stone, damp wool, and the gradual realization that your romantic notions about knighthood are about as historically accurate as a Hollywood blockbuster. The truth is, being a knight isn't about riding off into glorious battle. It's about waking up in a drafty stone bee, putting on 60 pounds of metal, and spending your day practicing the same sword movements you've been practicing for the last 15 years, all while trying not to think about how your lower back feels like it's been worked over by an enthusiastic torturer. But you're awake now, and the day ahead beckons with all the excitement of watching paint dry on a cathedral wall. Time to get dressed in your medieval Halloween costume and pretend that walking around in a metal suit designed by someone who clearly never heard of ergonomics is the height of nobility, because that's what being a knight really is. A very expensive, very uncomfortable way of saying you're too important to do manual labor, but not important enough to avoid getting killed in increasingly creative ways. Now comes the part of the night's day that Hollywood conveniently skips over: getting dressed. And by dressed, I mean encasing yourself in what can only be described as a human-shaped metal torture device that some optimistic blacksmith called protective armor. You make your way to the armor stand where your suit of plate mail hangs, like the empty shell of some particularly aggressive metal creature. This isn't the shining, perfectly fitted armor you see in movies. This is real medieval armor, which means it's heavy, uncomfortable, and apparently designed by someone who thought human beings were basically walking coat hangers. Your squire, a teenager named Jeffrey, who's about as enthusiastic about his job as you are about yours, begins the lengthy process of strapping you into your metal prison. And it is a prison. Once you're fully armored, you'll need help to mount your horse, help to get up if you fall down, and definitely help to use what medieval people politely called the guardrobe, though that's a humiliating process we'll mercifully skip. The process starts with your gambeson, a padded jacket that's supposed to protect you from the armor that's supposed to protect you from everything else. It's made of linen stuffed with whatever was handy. Old rags, hair, sometimes just more linen. The whole thing smells like it was stored in a barn, which it probably was. Jeffrey helps you into your leg armor. Greaves for your shins. Sabatons for your feet and knee cops that dig into your joints in ways that suggest the armorer had only a theoretical understanding of human anatomy. Each piece is held on with leather straps that Jeffrey tightens with the determination of someone trying to squeeze toothpaste out of an empty tube. Next comes the chainmail hauberk, a shirt made of thousands of tiny iron rings that weighs roughly as much as a small horse and provides about as much freedom of movement as a full-body cast. The chainmail goes over the gambeson, creating a delightful layer cake of discomfort. The metal rings catch on everything: your hair, your skin, the fabric beneath. Every movement produces a gentle jingling sound, like a very aggressive wind chime. The breastplate comes next, a curved piece of steel that's supposed to deflect sword blows, but mainly serves to redirect them toward your kidneys. Jeffrey hammers away at the buckles and straps, occasionally pausing to wipe the sweat from his brow. You can feel your ribs being gently compressed as he tightens everything down. Your arms get their own special treatment: re-rib braces for your upper arms, vam braces for your forearms, and gauntlets for your hands that turn your fingers into clumsy metal sausages. Try picking up a coin while wearing medieval gauntlets. Actually, don't try it. You'll be there all day. Finally, the helmet. Jeffrey lifts the great helm, a bucket-shaped piece of metal with narrow slits for vision and even narrower slits for breathing. He lowers it over your head, and suddenly the world becomes a series of vertical lines viewed through what feels like a medieval mailbox slot. The padding inside the helmet is damp with the accumulated sweat of previous wearings, and it smells like a gymnasium that's been closed for several decades. The whole process has taken the better part of an hour, and you're already exhausted before you've done anything more strenuous than standing still. You weigh about 60 pounds more than you did when you woke up, and every piece of metal seems determined to find new and creative ways to pinch, poke, or otherwise irritate your flesh. Jeffrey steps back to admire his handiwork, and you catch a glimpse of yourself in the polished surface of your shield. You look impressive, certainly, intimidating even, like a walking siege engine with delusions of grandeur, but you feel like someone wrapped you in a particularly aggressive suit of kitchen utensils and then asked you to go for a jog. Your peripheral vision is essentially non-existent. Turning your head requires turning your entire upper body, and breathing has become an activity that requires conscious effort and careful planning. This is your work uniform as a knight. Not a costume, not a fashion statement, but the gear you'll wear for the next 8 to 12 hours while you train patrol and try not to fall over. Because falling over while wearing 60 pounds of medieval metallurgy is not just embarrassing, it's potentially fatal. Knights have drowned in puddles because they couldn't get back up. And the best part, this armor isn't really designed to keep you safe from enemy weapons. It's designed to keep you alive just long enough to regret wearing it. Medieval warfare was less about protection and more about making sure that when you died, you did it in style. Geoffrey hands you your sword, 20 pounds of sharpened steel that you'll carry around all day like a very expensive, very deadly paperweight. You strap it to your side, feeling the weight pull at your already compressed spine. Congratulations! You're now fully dressed as a medieval knight. You look magnificent. You feel like you're wearing an iron lung. And your day of endless repetitive training is about to begin. Time to find out why most knights spent their careers not in glorious battle, but in slow motion preparation for glorious battle that usually turned out to be neither glorious nor particularly battle-like, but rather a brief, terrifying scuffle that ended with someone bleeding out in a muddy field while wondering why they didn't just become a monk. Fully armored and feeling like a walking silverware drawer, you clank your way down the stone steps to the castle courtyard. Each step echoes through the corridors like someone dropping a pot down a well, and you're acutely aware that stealth is no longer an option. Medieval knights don't sneak. They announce their presence from roughly half a mile away. The courtyard is already alive with the sounds of training. The thunk of wooden practice swords against shields, the scrape of metal on metal, and the occasional yelp of pain as someone discovers a gap in their armor the hard way. The smell of horse sweat and leather mingles with wood smoke from the blacksmith's forge, creating an aromatic reminder that you live in an age where deodorant is still about 600 years away. Your training master, Sir Edmund, stands in the center of the chaos, like a particularly grumpy island in a sea of controlled violence. He's 60 years old, which in medieval terms makes him roughly equivalent to a museum artifact, and he's survived this long by being too mean to die and too stubborn to retire. His face bears the kind of scars that come from decades of explaining sword technique to young men who thought they already knew everything. Right then, you steel-wrapped disasters! Sir Edmund bellows, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the subtle charm of a charging boar. Time to pretend you're warriors instead of expensive lawn ornaments. You take your place among the other knights for the morning's first exercise sword drill. This involves standing in formation and performing the same basic sword movements over and over and over again, like a very aggressive form of medieval aerobics. Overhead strike, diagonal cut thrust, parry repeat, for hours. The movements that look so fluid and natural in tapestries turn out to be exhausting when you're wearing the weight of a small anvil distributed across your body. Your sword, which seemed reasonably light when Geoffrey handed it to you now, feels like you're wielding a very long, very sharp crowbar. After 15 minutes of basic drills, your arms are burning. After 30 minutes, you're seriously considering a career change. After an hour, you're wondering if becoming a hermit monk might have been the wiser choice. But Sir Edmund isn't finished with you yet. Not even close. Mounting practice, he shouts, and your heart sinks like a stone in a very deep well. This is where the real humiliation begins. In full armor, mounting a horse is less like the graceful vault depicted in romantic literature and more like trying to climb a moving wardrobe while wearing an iron overcoat. Your horse a sturdy destrier named Thunderhoof, because medieval people were apparently required by law to give their horses dramatically stupid names, stands patiently while you approach. Thunderhoof is a war horse, which means he's been trained to bite, kick, and trample enemies on command. He's also been trained to tolerate having fully armored humans clamber onto his back like particularly noisy beetles. This doesn't mean he enjoys it, just that he's resigned to it. Jeffrey brings over the mounting block, a wooden platform that's supposed to make the process easier, but mainly serves to provide a slightly more elevated position from which to fall embarrassingly. You place one metal-encased foot on the stirrup, grip the saddle, and attempt to haul yourself up. This is where physics becomes your enemy. 60 pounds of armor doesn't just make you heavier, it makes you clumsier, more top-heavy, and prone to moving like a drunken scarecrow. Your first attempt ends with you halfway onto the horse, your leg caught in the stirrup, and Jeffrey trying not to laugh as he helps push you the rest of the way up. Once mounted, you feel like you're sitting on top of a mobile earthquake. Thunderhoof's every step translates through your armor as a series of clanks, rattles, and impacts that remind you that your spine wasn't designed for this kind of abuse. The stirrups are positioned for optimal leg protection, which means your knees are bent at angles that would make a yoga instructor wince. Lance work, Sir Edmund calls out, and you suppress a groan that would be audible even through your helmet. Lance work involves taking a 12-foot wooden pole with a sharp metal point and trying to hit targets while riding at speed. This sounds simple in theory. In practice, it's like trying to thread a needle while riding a roller coaster during an earthquake. You're handed your lance, a weapon that's longer than some trees and roughly as wieldy as a telegraph pole. The weight distribution is all wrong. The balance point is somewhere near your elbow, and the whole thing seems determined to either drag you off your horse or impale something you weren't aiming at. The target is a wooden post with a shield hanging from it about 50 yards away across the practice field. Your job is to hit the center of the shield while riding at full gallop, controlling your horse with your knees holding your lance steady and trying not to fall off. What actually happens is that you charge across the field like a caffeinated earthquake, your lance wavering like a dowsing rod in a thunderstorm, while Thunderhoof does his best to compensate for the fact that his rider has all the grace and balance of a bag of hammers. Your first pass misses the target entirely. Your lance wobbles past the post like you were trying to joust with a fish. Sir Edmund's commentary is both loud and colorful, containing words that probably haven't been used in church services. Your second pass hits the post, but not the shield. The impact travels up the lance shaft and into your shoulder like someone hitting you with a very long, very expensive baseball bat. The force nearly unseats you, and you spend several uncomfortable seconds bouncing around in your saddle like a metal pinball. Your third pass, well, let's just say that at least you didn't fall off this time. This continues for the better part of the morning. Lance work, sword work, mounted combat drills, dismounted combat drills, and formation fighting. Each exercise is designed to prepare you for the realities of medieval warfare, which mainly consist of being very tired, very sore, and very aware that your expensive equipment is trying to kill you almost as enthusiastically as any enemy. By noon, you're exhausted, bruised, and beginning to understand why medieval knights were known for their short tempers. It's hard to maintain a chivalrous attitude when your armor is chafing, your horse is plotting against you, and your training master treats you like a particularly disappointing piece of military equipment. But the morning practice session is just that, the morning session. After a brief lunch break, during which you'll discover that eating while wearing a helmet is both challenging and messy, you'll be back for the afternoon training. Because in medieval times, the only thing better than being tired and sore was being more tired and more sore. And this is just training. This is what you do when there's no actual war to fight, no enemy to face, no quest to complete. This is what knights spent 90% of their time doing, practicing for the 10% of the time when they might actually need to use these skills, which raises the question, what happens when the practice becomes reality? when the wooden swords are replaced with sharp steel and the practice targets are replaced with people who are trying very hard to kill you. Well, that's when things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean terrifying, brutal, and mercifully brief. It's a Tuesday in late autumn when the horn sounds. Not the gentle morning horn that signals the start of training, but the urgent, panicked blast that means something is actually happening. You're in the middle of your afternoon sword drill when the sound cuts across the courtyard like a rusty blade, and every knight stops mid-swing. Sir Edmund's scarred face breaks into what might charitably be called a smile, but looks more like a death's head grimace. "Well, lads," he says, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. "Looks like all that practice is about to pay off. Raiders have been spotted heading for the village. Time to earn your keep." The transformation in the courtyard is immediate. The casual brutality of training gives way to the focused urgency of actual preparation. Squires rush to check armor fittings, weapons are inspected with newfound intensity, and the air fills with the kind of nervous energy that comes when people realize they might actually die in the next few hours. You find yourself oddly calm as Jeffrey checks your armor one final time. All those months of repetitive training have created a kind of muscle memory that kicks in automatically. Your sword feels familiar in your hand, your armor settles into its accustomed aches and pains, and Thunderhoof seems to sense the change in atmosphere. The ride to the village takes about 20 minutes, and it's during this ride that you begin to understand the difference between training and reality. The countryside, which looked so peaceful and pastoral during your morning exercises, now seems full of potential ambush sites. Every copse of trees could hide enemies. Every hill could conceal archers. Every shadow could contain death. Your fellow knights ride in formation, but the neat lines of the practice field have given way to something more organic and defensive. Conversations are muted, conducted in the kind of low voices that suggest everyone is trying very hard not to think about what they might be riding toward. The village, when you reach it, is a study in controlled panic. Smoke rises from several buildings, and you can see bodies scattered in the muddy streets. The raiders, a mixed band of brigands and dispossessed soldiers looking to supplement their income through creative entrepreneurship, have done their work efficiently, but they're still there and they're not particularly concerned about your arrival. Why should they be? They outnumber your small force 2-1. They're battle-hardened from years of this kind of work, and they've chosen their position well, using the village buildings as cover and forcing you to attack uphill across open ground. This is where all those hours of training either pay off or prove utterly worthless. Sir Edmund raises his hand for silence, and the world seems to hold its breath. The only sounds are the distant shouts of the raiders, the creak of leather and metal, and the labored breathing of nervous horses. "Remember your training," Sir Edmund says quietly. "Stay in formation, watch your flanks, and try not to die stupidly." It's possibly the least inspiring pre-battle speech in military history, but it has the virtue of being honest. The charge, when it comes, is nothing like the romantic descriptions and songs and stories. There's no thunderous gallop, no heroic battle cries, no glorious clash of arms. Instead, there's the awkward acceleration of heavily armored men on tired horses trying to maintain formation while navigating the uneven ground between you and the enemy. Your lance feels unwieldy and wrong. Nothing like the familiar practice weapon you've been using for months. The distance to the enemy seems both impossibly long and terrifyingly short. Thunderhoof's hooves throw up clods of muddy earth that spatter against your armor like medieval shrapnel. The first contact is over in seconds. Your lance finds its mark, a raider who was apparently too busy looting to notice several tons of armored knight bearing down on him. The impact jars your entire body. The lance shatters, and suddenly you're in among the enemy with nothing but your sword and whatever fighting skills you can remember while adrenaline turns your brain into medieval jelly. Medieval combat, it turns out, is nothing like the carefully choreographed duels you see in movies. It's chaotic, exhausting, and remarkably unpleasant. People are shouting, screaming, bleeding, and dying, often all at the same time. The air fills with the sounds of metal on metal, metal on wood, and occasionally metal on things that make wet, unpleasant noises. Your armor, which felt impossibly heavy during training, now feels like the only thing standing between you and immediate death. A raider with a warhammer tries to introduce your helmet to his weapon with more enthusiasm than skill, and you feel the impact rattle your teeth. Your sword work, so precise and controlled in practice, becomes a desperate series of cuts and thrusts that have more to do with not dying than with any particular technique. The fight lasts maybe 10 minutes, though it feels like hours. Medieval battles aren't the epic day-long affairs of legend. They're brief, brutal encounters that end when one side decides that dying for whatever they were fighting for isn't worth the inconvenience. In this case, the raiders decide that looting villages is considerably less appealing when heavily armored knights are trying to separate their heads from their shoulders. They break and run, leaving behind their wounded, their dead, and most of their stolen goods. You find yourself standing in the village square, breathing heavily inside your helmet and trying to process what just happened. Your sword is covered in blood that isn't yours. Your armor bears several new dents that will require the blacksmith's attention, and Thunderhoof is looking at you with the patient expression of a horse who's seen this all before. The aftermath of a medieval skirmish is nothing like the glorious victory celebrations depicted in romantic literature. There are wounded to tend, dead to bury, and the grim business of separating the permanently damaged from the merely inconvenienced. Your fellow knights move through the village like metal-clad ghosts, checking bodies and trying to help where they can. Sir Edmund appears at your elbow, his armor significantly more battered than yours, a cut on his cheek that's already beginning to bruise. "Not bad for your first real fight," he says, his voice carrying the kind of weary satisfaction that comes from surviving something that could easily have gone the other way. You didn't fall off your horse, you didn't run away, and you didn't accidentally kill any villagers. That puts you ahead of about half the knights I've trained. You realize that this is probably the closest thing to praise you're going to get from Sir Edmund, and you feel an odd sense of accomplishment. You faced real combat and survived. You've proven that all those hours of training weren't completely wasted. But as you ride back to the castle, you can't shake the feeling that you've just been incredibly lucky. The raiders you faced were disorganized brigands, not trained soldiers. The fight was brief and one-sided, not the kind of prolonged, desperate battle that separates the living from the dead. You've had your first taste of combat, but you haven't really been tested. That test, when it comes, will be far more serious than a village raid, because while you've been practicing with wooden swords and chasing brigands, larger forces are moving across the land. Armies are gathering, allegiances are shifting, and the kind of war that makes history books is brewing just beyond the horizon. And when that war comes, all your training, all your practice, all your careful preparation will be put to the ultimate test. Not against disorganized raiders looking for easy profit, but against professional soldiers who know their business and are very good at killing knights. But that's a story for another day. For now, you're content to ride back to your cold stone chamber, let Geoffrey help you out of your dented armor, and try not to think about how close you came to ending up as just another casualty in someone else's war. Because that's what being a knight really is. Long periods of boredom punctuated by brief moments of absolute terror, all while wearing enough metal to open a small blacksmith shop. 3 months later, the real war arrives at your doorstep like an extremely unwelcome dinner guest who brings their own army. You wake one morning to find the horizon lined with banners, pavilions, and the kind of organized military infrastructure that suggests someone has been planning this visit for a very long time. The besieging army spreads across the landscape like a particularly aggressive rash, complete with siege engines that look like medieval mechanical monsters designed by someone with a very dark sense of humor. The enemy has brought everything trebuchets that can hurl 300-pound stones with the accuracy of a drunk giant mangonels that fire volleys of smaller projectiles like angry wooden hail and ballistas that shoot bolts the size of small trees. They've also brought patience, which in siege warfare is often more deadly than any weapon. Your castle, which seemed so imposing and secure during your daily training routines, suddenly feels less like a fortress and more like a very expensive stone trap. The walls that looked thick enough to stop anything now seem inadequately thin. The towers that projected such strength now feel like obvious targets for enemy artillery. Sir Edmund gathers the knights in the Great Hall for what military historians would generously call a strategic briefing, but which is really more of a here's how we're probably all going to die informational session. Right then, he begins his scarred face bearing the kind of expression usually reserved for tax collectors and plague announcements. We're outnumbered about 5 to 1. They've got enough siege equipment to knock down a mountain, and they're being led by someone who's apparently read a book about siege warfare. The good news is that we've got thick walls, plenty of food, and the moral righteousness of our cause. He pauses to let this sink in. The bad news is that moral righteousness doesn't stop trebuchet stones, and thick walls only work until someone builds a bigger trebuchet. The siege settles in with the grim inevitability of winter. The enemy establishes their camp well out of arrow range, constructs their siege engines with the methodical efficiency of experienced professionals, and begins the slow process of reducing your castle to rubble one stone at a time. Your daily routine changes dramatically. Instead of training in the courtyard, you spend your time manning the walls, watching for signs of attack, and trying not to flinch every time a trebuchet stone crashes into the battlements somewhere nearby. Sleep becomes a luxury enjoyed in brief installments between alerts and meals, or eaten standing up while keeping one eye on the enemy lines. The first assault comes on a Tuesday because apparently medieval armies don't believe in building suspense. You're awakened before dawn by the sound of war horns, not the familiar castle signals, but the deep, braying calls of enemy trumpets that seem designed to inspire dread in anyone with functioning ears. From your position on the wall, you can see the attacking force assembling in the pale pre-dawn light. Ladder teams shielded by archers and crossbowmen, battering ram crews preparing their massive wooden engine, assault troops carrying shields, weapons, and the kind of grim determination that suggests they've done this before. The attack, when it comes, is nothing like the village skirmish. This is professional warfare conducted by people who kill for a living and are very good at their job. Arrows whistle overhead like angry wasps, crossbow bolts thud into wooden shields, and occasionally into things that make wet, unpleasant sounds. The air fills with smoke from burning pitch and the kind of organized chaos that only comes when several hundred people are trying to kill several hundred other people in a relatively small space. Your job is to prevent enemy soldiers from climbing over the walls using ladders, which sounds simple but turns out to be remarkably complicated when the people climbing those ladders are professionals who really want to kill you. Medieval siege warfare is essentially a vertical knife fight conducted with long, pointy sticks while people shoot arrows at you from below. You find yourself using skills you never practiced during training, pushing ladders away from the wall while avoiding the spears of the men climbing them, pouring boiling oil through murder holes onto attackers below, using your sword to cut rope and your mace to discourage anyone who makes it to the top of the battlements. It's exhausting, terrifying, and remarkably unpleasant work. Your armor, which felt heavy during training, now feels like the difference between life and a very unpleasant death. Every piece of metal that previously seemed designed to annoy you now proves its worth by stopping arrows deflecting spear points and generally keeping your internal organs internal. The assault lasts for 6 hours, though time becomes meaningless when you are engaged in the kind of work where momentary inattention can result in permanent unemployment. By the time the enemy withdraws, you're so tired that standing upright requires conscious effort, and your sword arm feels like it's been worked over by an enthusiastic torturer. But the siege isn't over. If anything, it's just beginning. The enemy retreats to lick their wounds, count their casualties, and plan their next attempt. Meanwhile, you get to enjoy the unique pleasures of being trapped in a stone box with several hundred other people, a diminishing food supply, and the certain knowledge that the next attack will be better planned and more determined than the last. Medieval sieges aren't won or lost in a single assault. They're wars of attrition tests, of endurance, and exercises in seeing who runs out of food arrows or sanity first. Days stretch into weeks, weeks into months, and the siege becomes a way of life rather than a temporary inconvenience. You learn things about yourself during a siege that you never learned during training. You discover that you can function on 2 hours of sleep and meals that consist mainly of bread that's more mold than grain. You find out that terror can become routine, that boredom and mortal danger can coexist, and that the human capacity for adaptation extends to circumstances that would have seemed unimaginable during peacetime. You also learn about your fellow knights, who can be counted on during the desperate hours before dawn when the enemy launches another assault, who cracks under the pressure and has to be quietly reassigned to duties that don't involve sharp objects, who dies heroically, who dies stupidly, and who dies for reasons that have nothing to do with enemy action and everything to do with the fact that medieval medicine's understanding of infection is roughly equivalent to a modern child's understanding of quantum physics. The siege drags on through summer and into autumn. The enemy tries everything: direct assault tunneling, under the walls siege towers that look like mobile wooden castles, and catapults that fire everything from stones to dead horses. You and your fellow defenders respond with boiling oil, Greek fire arrows, crossbow bolts, and the kind of creative violence that comes from having nothing to lose and nowhere to run. But slowly, inexorably, the castle's defenses begin to crumble. Not just from enemy action, but from the simple mathematics of siege warfare. Arrows run low, food spoils, wells become contaminated, men sicken and die from diseases that have nothing to do with enemy weapons and everything to do with the fact that sanitation in a besieged castle makes a medieval village look like a modern hospital. By winter, it's clear that the siege can't continue much longer, not because the enemy is giving up, but because there simply aren't enough defenders left to man the walls effectively. What started as a garrison of 200 has been reduced to fewer than 50 through combat casualties, disease, and the kind of accidents that happen when exhausted people work with dangerous equipment in poor lighting. The end comes not with a final glorious battle, but with a negotiated surrender. Sir Edmund, his scarred face now bearing several new marks of distinction, meets with the enemy commander under a flag of truce. The terms are surprisingly reasonable. The surviving defenders will be allowed to leave with their arms and armor. The castle will be surrendered intact, and nobody will be executed for the crime of making the siege more difficult than it needed to be. You march out of the castle gates on a cold winter morning wearing armor that bears the dents and scratches of 6 months of siege warfare. Behind you, the castle that was your home and fortress now flies enemy banners. Ahead of you lies uncertainty, unemployment, and the need to find a new lord willing to feed and house a knight whose most recent job reference involves losing a siege. This is how most medieval military careers end, not in glorious death or heroic victory, but in negotiated surrender followed by the need to find new employment in a job market where the primary qualification is the ability to kill people efficiently while wearing expensive metal clothing. As you ride away from the castle, you reflect on the curious nature of knighthood. You've spent years training for war, months engaged in actual warfare, and now you're unemployed because your employer's castle has new management. All that practice, all that preparation, all those hours of sword drill and mounted combat have led to this riding away from a lost siege with nothing to show for it but a collection of scars and the hard-won knowledge that real warfare is nothing like the stories. But perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. Knighthood isn't about glory or romance or heroic quests. It's about doing a difficult, dangerous job with professional competence, surviving when possible, and maintaining some semblance of honor, even when honor doesn't pay the bills or stop trebuchet stones. And if that sounds less exciting than the legends suggest, well, that's because legends are written by people who never had to wear 60 pounds of armor while defending a wall against professional soldiers who really wanted to kill them. The reality of being a knight is far more mundane and far more terrifying than any story. It's also in its own way more impressive because it takes a special kind of courage to wake up every morning, put on your armor, and go do a job that might kill you, not for glory or adventure, but simply because it's what you've trained for and what the world expects of you. 5 years after the siege, you find yourself in service to a new lord, Sir Roderick of Ashworth, a minor baron whose greatest military achievement was inheriting a small castle and a large collection of debts from his recently deceased father. Your new home is Ashworth Keep, a fortress that optimistically calls itself a castle, but would be more accurately described as a fortified manor house with delusions of grandeur. The keep sits on a low hill overlooking farmland that stretches to the horizon like a particularly monotonous tapestry. There are no enemy armies on that horizon, no hostile banners, no siege engines being assembled by people who wish you ill. Just fields, farms, and the occasional merchant caravan moving along the muddy track that generously calls itself the King's Road. This is peace, and you're beginning to understand why so many knights drink. Your daily routine has settled into a pattern that would be familiar to anyone who's ever had a job that involves mostly waiting for something to happen. You wake at dawn in your stone chamber, marginally warmer than your previous accommodation, but still possessing all the cozy charm of a well-appointed tomb. Geoffrey, now several years older and considerably more cynical, helps you into your armor with the weary efficiency of someone who's done this particular job far too many times. The morning inspection of the walls has become a ritual as empty as it is necessary. You walk the battlements checking for signs of decay, enemy activity, or anything else that might require attention. What you find is mortar that needs pointing, stones that need replacing, and a view of countryside that remains stubbornly peaceful. The garrison at Ashworth Keep consists of yourself, 2 other knights of similarly questionable prospects, a handful of men-at-arms who seem to have learned their trade from someone who'd heard about warfare secondhand, and a collection of servants who treat military service as a slightly more dangerous form of agricultural work. Sir Roderick himself is the kind of lord who inspires neither fear nor respect, but rather a sort of weary resignation. He's 35 years old, soft around the middle from too much ale and too little exercise, and possessed of the kind of strategic mind that considers ordering dinner a complex military operation. His greatest concern isn't defending his lands from invasion, but figuring out how to pay for the roof repairs before the next heavy rain. Training continues because what else are you going to do? But training in peacetime has a different quality than training during war. The urgency is gone, replaced by the kind of mechanical repetition that characterizes any job where the primary requirement is showing up and looking competent. You practice your sword work against opponents who've been practicing the same moves for years. You ride patrol routes through countryside where the most dangerous thing you're likely to encounter is a merchant who's confused about which road leads to the market town. You maintain equipment that never gets used, prepare for threats that never materialize, and try to stay sharp for battles that never come. The boredom is profound and pervasive. It seeps into everything like damp in winter walls, turning routine into tedium and vigilance into vacant staring. You find yourself looking forward to minor emergencies, a sick horse, a dispute between farmers, a drunk villager who needs to be reminded that the Lord's chickens are not communal property, simply because they break the monotony. Your fellow knights Sir Baldwin and Sir Geoffrey, not your squire, a different Geoffrey. The medieval world apparently had a severe shortage of names, have adapted to peacetime service in their own ways. Sir Baldwin has developed a philosophical bent and spends his free time composing terrible poetry about the nature of honor and duty. Sir Geoffrey has become an expert on ale and can discourse at length about the relative merits of different brewing techniques, a skill that would be more impressive if the local ale wasn't uniformly terrible. The three of you have fallen into the habit of gathering in the evening to share whatever passes for entertainment in a minor castle during peacetime. This usually consists of gambling with dice that are probably loaded, telling stories that become more impressive with each retelling, and complaining about the quality of the food, the dampness of the walls, and the general unfairness of a world that trains men for war and then refuses to provide wars. I was talking to a merchant yesterday, Sir Baldwin announces one evening, settling onto a wooden bench with the careful movements of a man whose armor has left permanent impressions on his body. He says there's been fighting in France, real fighting with armies and sieges and everything. This news is received with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for rumors of buried treasure or news that the local brewery has improved its product. France might as well be on the moon for all the relevance it has to your current situation, but it represents something that's been missing from your life purpose. My cousin serves with the Earl of Warwick, Sir Geoffrey adds, taking a long pull from his cup of ale. He says they're looking for experienced knights, good pay chance for advancement, all the fighting a man could want. The conversation that follows is the kind that happens when men who've trained their entire lives for war find themselves trapped in peace. There's talk of seeking service elsewhere, of finding lords who have enemies worth fighting, of abandoning the security of steady employment for the uncertainty of active campaign. But in the end, you all know you'll stay where you are. Not from loyalty to Sir Roderick, who inspires about as much devotion as a wet dog, but from the simple reality that changing employers in the knightly profession is considerably more complicated than finding a new job as a blacksmith or a baker. Knights don't just work for lords. They're bound to them by oaths, obligations, and the kind of feudal contracts that make modern employment law look simple and straightforward. Besides, at your age, you're now 32, which in medieval military terms makes you practically elderly. The prospect of starting over with a new lord, learning new routines, and proving yourself all over again seems almost as exhausting as staying put. So you remain at Ashworth Keep, going through the motions of military preparedness while secretly wondering if this is what the rest of your life will look like. Days that blend into weeks that blend into seasons, that blend into years, all marked by the same routines, the same responsibilities, and the same gradual accumulation of aches and pains that come from wearing armor for a living. The only real excitement comes from the occasional arrival of news from the outside world. Rumors of wars fought by other people in distant places, stories of knights who found glory and profit in service to greater lords, tales of campaigns and conquests that make your daily routine of wall walking and sword polishing seem even more pointless than usual. But perhaps that's the real lesson of knighthood, that for every glorious battle there are years of mundane service. For every moment of heroic action, there are months of simple endurance. For every knight who achieves fame and fortune, there are dozens who spend their careers guarding walls that never need defending, preparing for wars that never come and growing old, in the service of lords who are remembered by history mainly for their ability to pay their bills on time. It's not the life you imagined when you first put on armor and dreamed of glory. But it's the life you have, and perhaps that's enough. After all, peace, however boring, beats war, however glorious. You've seen enough of war to know that glory is usually brief, often posthumous, and invariably paid for in blood and suffering. Still, on quiet evenings, when the only sound is the wind through the battlements and the distant lowing of cattle, you sometimes find yourself staring at the horizon and wondering what might be happening beyond it, wondering if somewhere out there other knights are living the kind of life you once thought knighthood would provide. But then morning comes, Geoffrey helps you into your armor, and you walk the walls of Ashworth Keep, keeping watch over a countryside that remains stubbornly peaceful. Because that's what knights do even when, especially when, there's nothing to do. After 7 years of peaceful service at Ashworth Keep, salvation arrives in an unexpected form: Sir Roderick's creditors. Specifically the kind of creditors who express their displeasure with late payments by bringing armed men and legal documents that threaten to turn your employer's modest estate into someone else's modest estate. The resolution is swift and economically brutal. Sir Roderick, faced with the choice between bankruptcy and creative financing, decides to send his knights on what he optimistically calls extended leave to pursue opportunities for professional advancement. What he means is that he can't afford to pay you anymore, but he's too embarrassed to simply fire you. This is how you find yourself at the age of 39, effectively unemployed, and forced to consider career options that don't involve steady wages, regular meals, or sleeping indoors on a reliable basis. The medieval job market for aging knights is not what you'd call robust, particularly when your most recent employment ended with your employer's financial collapse. Geoffrey, now a middle-aged squire with the kind of professional loyalty that survives even economic hardship, suggests an alternative that had never seriously occurred to you: the tournament circuit. Tournaments, in theory, offer a way for knights to display their skills, earn prize money, and attract the attention of lords who might be looking for experienced military professionals. In practice, they're a combination of sporting event, carnival, and carefully choreographed violence that attracts knights, merchants, entertainers, pickpockets, and spectators with more enthusiasm than sense. Your first tournament is held at the market town of Fairhaven, a prosperous community that's decided to celebrate the harvest season by watching armored men attempt to knock each other unconscious for the entertainment of paying customers. The tournament field is a large meadow outside the town walls, surrounded by wooden stands for spectators and colorful pavilions for the participating knights. The scene is unlike anything you've experienced during your years of actual military service. Banners flutter in the breeze, merchants hawk food and drink to the crowds, and minstrels wander through the assembly singing songs about knightly valor that bear roughly the same relationship to reality as fairy tales do to actual history. The other knights are a mixed lot. Some are young men from noble families here to gain experience and prove their worth. Others are career soldiers between employers like yourself. A few are older men who've made tournament fighting their primary profession, traveling from event to event like medieval professional athletes. The competition consists of several events, each designed to test different knightly skills. There's the joust, where knights charge at each other with lances while trying not to fall off their horses. The melee, which is essentially a controlled riot with swords, and various individual challenges involving archery, swordplay, and demonstrations of horsemanship. Your first joust is against Sir Marcus of Bridgeton, a young knight who looks like he stepped off a church fresco dedicated to martial virtue. His armor is polished to mirror brightness. His horse is a magnificent destrier that probably cost more than you've earned in the past 5 years, and his lance bears the kind of colorful pennant that suggests he takes the ceremonial aspects of knighthood very seriously indeed. You, by contrast, look like what you are, a middle-aged professional soldier whose equipment has seen better decades. Your armor bears the dents and scratches of actual use. Your horse is a reliable but unspectacular courser that Geoffrey acquired through means he prefers not to discuss, and your lance is functional but decidedly undecorated. The herald announces the participants with the kind of flowery language that medieval people apparently couldn't get enough of. Sir Marcus of Bridgeton, flower of chivalry, defender of the innocent, champion of virtue, followed by Sir, your name, veteran of the siege of, The herald pauses, clearly uncertain about your credentials. Veteran knight in the service of Sir Roderick of Ashworth. The crowd's response to these introductions is telling. Sir Marcus receives the kind of enthusiastic cheering usually reserved for folk heroes and free ale. Your introduction is met with polite applause from spectators who are clearly wondering if you're supposed to be the villain in this particular entertainment. The joust itself is over in seconds. You and Sir Marcus charge toward each other at full gallop, lances leveled, while the crowd holds its collective breath. The impact when it comes is exactly what you expected and nothing like what the spectators hoped for. Your lance takes Sir Marcus squarely in the center of his chest, the blow transmitted through his armor with the kind of mathematical precision that comes from years of practice. His own lance goes wide, thrown off by the impact of your strike. He leaves his saddle like a sack of particularly expensive grain and hits the ground with a crash that can be heard in the cheap seats. The crowd's reaction is mixed. They came to see the young, handsome knight triumph over the grizzled veteran. What they got was a practical demonstration of why experience usually beats enthusiasm in any profession involving violence. Sir Marcus, to his credit, takes his defeat with grace. He congratulates you on a well-struck blow, accepts the polite applause of the crowd, and retires to his pavilion to contemplate the gap between romantic idealism and professional competence. You win the joust, collect your prize money, a purse that's modest but welcome, and discover that you've accidentally become the tournament's unofficial villain. The crowd needs someone to cheer against, and an aging knight who defeats their favorites with workmanlike efficiency fits the role perfectly. This pattern repeats itself throughout the tournament circuit. You travel from town to town, competing in events that test skills you've been developing for decades, and consistently defeating younger, more idealistic opponents through the simple expedient of being better at the job of hitting people with medieval weapons. Your reputation grows, but not in the way you might have hoped. You become known as the Ashworth veteran, a knight who wins tournaments through boring efficiency rather than spectacular displays of chivalry. Spectators appreciate your competence while secretly hoping someone will knock you off your horse in a particularly dramatic fashion. The money is decent, not enough to make you wealthy, but sufficient to keep you fed, housed, and equipped. More importantly, the tournament circuit provides something that your years of peaceful service lacked: purpose. You're doing what you've trained for, using skills that would otherwise atrophy, and earning a living through the profession you've spent your life learning. But tournament fighting is different from actual warfare in ways that become more apparent with experience. The goal isn't to kill your opponent, but to defeat them according to specific rules while providing entertainment for paying customers. The violence is real, but it's controlled, regulated, and performed for an audience that wants to see a good show rather than effective military action. You adapt to this new environment with the same professional competence that's characterized your entire career. You learn to read crowds, to understand what they want to see, and occasionally to provide it. You develop a tournament persona, not quite a character, but a version of yourself that's slightly larger, slightly more dramatic, and considerably more entertaining than the real thing. The irony isn't lost on you. After years of training for war and serving in actual combat, you found your most successful career as a performer, entertaining crowds with carefully controlled violence while wearing armor that's become more costume than protection. But perhaps that's appropriate. Medieval society loves the idea of knighthood more than the reality of it. People want to see knights who embody their ideals of honor, courage, and martial prowess, not professional soldiers who do a difficult job with competent efficiency. So you give them what they want: a villain they can cheer against, a veteran they can respect, and a reminder that experience usually triumphs over enthusiasm. It's not the career you planned, but it's the career you have, and it's better than sitting in a drafty castle waiting for wars that never come. The tournament circuit becomes your new life, and it's not a bad one. You travel, you compete, you earn money doing something you're good at, and you provide entertainment for people who appreciate martial skill, even when they don't fully understand it. Most importantly, you're still a knight, still practicing the profession you've spent your life learning, still wearing armor and carrying weapons and doing the things that define knighthood. It may not be the glorious career you once imagined, but it's honest work, and in a world where many knights spend their time growing soft in peaceful castles, that's something to be proud of. By your 45th birthday, a milestone that medieval actuarial tables would consider optimistically ambitious, the tournament circuit has become both your livelihood and your increasingly obvious enemy. What started as a practical solution to unemployment has evolved into a grinding test of endurance between your accumulated skills and your deteriorating body. The morning routine has acquired new elements of grim comedy. Jeffrey, now sporting gray hair and a collection of aches that mirror your own, helps you into armor that seems to grow heavier with each passing season. Your morning inventory of injuries has become a ritual: the shoulder that dislocated during last month's tournament in Westbridge, the ribs that protest every time you breathe deeply, thanks to that memorable encounter with Sir Garrett's mace, and the persistent back pain that's become your most reliable companion. Perhaps Jeffrey suggests diplomatically, as he struggles with a buckle that your swollen knuckles can no longer manage, it might be time to consider other opportunities. By other opportunities, he means retirement, but Jeffrey is too tactful to use that word directly. Retirement for a knight is a euphemism for admitting that you're no longer capable of doing the job that's defined your entire adult life. It's professional death by natural causes. Your current destination is the Michaelmas tournament at Crosshaven, a 3-day event that's become one of the season's most prestigious competitions. The prize money is substantial, the competition is fierce, and the crowds are large enough to make victory both profitable and reputation-enhancing. You're also keenly aware that this might be your last realistic chance to compete at this level. The younger knights on the circuit have begun treating you with the kind of respectful deference usually reserved for museum pieces and elderly relatives. Their courtesy is genuine, but it carries an undertone of pity that's more insulting than outright mockery would be. The joust bracket at Crosshaven reads like a survey of knightly generations. There's Sir Edmund the Younger, no relation to your old training master, a 22-year-old knight whose armor gleams like polished silver and whose confidence radiates from every gesture. Sir Robert of Millhaven, a seasoned professional in his early 30s who's built a solid reputation through consistent performance rather than spectacular displays. And Sir William the Bold, a contemporary of yours who's managed to maintain his competitive edge through a combination of skill, experience, and what you suspect is an increasingly creative relationship with tournament regulations. Your first opponent is Sir Thomas of Greenfield, a knight in his late 20s who represents everything you used to be: competent, confident, and convinced that experience is no substitute for youthful vigor. The pre-joust ceremony proceeds with the usual fanfare, but you notice that the crowd's reaction has changed. Where once you were the villain they loved to hate, now you're the aging veteran. They watch with morbid curiosity, wondering if this will be the tournament where time finally catches up with you. The charge feels different this time. Thunderhoof, now as middle-aged as his rider, lacks the explosive acceleration of his younger years. Your lance feels heavier in your hands, and your armor seems to shift and settle in ways that suggest Geoffrey's careful adjustments aren't quite compensating for changes in your body. Sir Thomas's lance takes you cleanly in the center of your shield, and for the first time in 3 years of tournament competition, you feel yourself leaving the saddle. The fall is neither graceful nor brief. You hit the ground with a crash that rattles your teeth and sends shooting pains through joints that have absorbed too many similar impacts over the years. The crowd's reaction is telling. Instead of the enthusiastic cheering that would have greeted your defeat 5 years ago, there's an uncomfortable silence. You've become the old fighter that everyone respects, but no one wants to see hurt. Your fall is less victory for your opponent than confirmation of mortality's inevitable triumph over skill. Geoffrey helps you to your feet with practiced efficiency, but you can see the concern in his expression. This isn't the controlled fall of a knight who's been outmaneuvered. It's the clumsy tumble of a man whose reflexes are no longer quite fast enough for the work he's trying to do. The individual combat competition goes better partly because it plays to your strengths and partly because your opponents are clearly holding back. Nobody wants to be the knight who seriously injures a respected veteran in front of a crowd that's already uncomfortable with the obvious signs of your physical decline. You advance through the early rounds through a combination of technique, experience, and what you suspect is misplaced chivalry on the part of younger opponents who seem more concerned with not hurting you than with winning their matches. It's professionally insulting and personally humiliating, but you need the prize money too badly to refuse the charity. The final against Sir Edmund the Younger is a masterclass in the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Edmund has clearly studied your technique, probably by watching your previous tournament performances, and he's developed strategies specifically designed to exploit the weaknesses that come with age. He fights at a pace that would have been comfortable for you 10 years ago, but is now just beyond your ability to sustain. He forces you to move, to react, to expend energy in ways that your younger self would have handled easily, but that your current body simply can't maintain for the duration of a serious combat. The end comes not with a dramatic exchange of blows, but with simple exhaustion. Your sword becomes too heavy to lift effectively. Your footwork loses its precision, and Edmund's final attack finds you too tired to mount an adequate defense. You yield with as much grace as you can muster, accept the crowd's sympathetic applause, and collect your runner-up prize while trying not to think about how obvious your limitations have become to everyone watching. That evening, sharing ale with Geoffrey in the inn, where you've taken rooms, you finally have the conversation you've been avoiding for months. "How long do you think we can keep doing this?" you ask, gesturing vaguely toward the tournament field where tomorrow's competitions will continue without your participation. Jeffrey, who's been your squire for nearly 2 decades and has watched you transition from promising young knight to seasoned veteran to aging has-been, considers the question with the seriousness it deserves. Honestly, I think we're already past the point where we should be doing this, he says. You're still good enough to avoid serious injury most of the time, but that's not the same as being good enough to win. And the day you stop being good enough to avoid injury, he doesn't finish the sentence, but he doesn't need to. You've both seen what happens to knights who continue competing past their prime. The tournament circuit is littered with men who refuse to acknowledge their limitations until those limitations were demonstrated in the most permanent way possible. The conversation turns to practical matters, savings accumulated over years of tournament competition, potential alternatives to active knighthood, and the logistics of transitioning from professional fighter to whatever comes next. You have enough money to purchase a small farm, or to establish yourself as a trainer of younger knights, or to seek employment in some administrative capacity with a lord who values experience over physical capability. None of these options offers the satisfaction of active competition, but they all have the significant advantage of not requiring you to risk your life on a regular basis. The decision, when you finally make it, comes not from any single moment of revelation, but from the accumulated weight of evidence that your body is no longer capable of supporting your ambitions. You're still a knight, still capable of doing knightly things, but you're no longer capable of doing them at the level required for tournament competition. It's a bitter recognition, but it's also a practical one. Better to retire while you can still walk away under your own power than to continue until someone carries you away on a stretcher. Your last tournament is at Crosshaven, where it all began to fall apart. You enter only the individual combat competition, fighting with the careful precision of someone who's no longer trying to win, but simply trying to finish with dignity intact. You're eliminated in the semifinals by a knight young enough to be your son, but you manage the defeat with grace and professionalism. The crowd gives you a standing ovation. When you leave the field, a gesture of respect that's both gratifying and final. That night, you and Jeffrey pack your gear for the last time as active competitors. Tomorrow, you'll begin the journey toward whatever comes next. But tonight, you're still a knight, still a warrior, still someone who spent his life in service to ideals that may be impractical but are not worthless. The career is ending, but the life continues. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all, that knowing when to stop is just as important as knowing how to start, and that dignity in defeat is often more valuable than victory without honor. 2 years after your final tournament, you find yourself in a place you never expected to be content. Your small farm sits in a valley 3 days' ride from the nearest castle, surrounded by rolling hills that are notable mainly for their complete lack of military significance. No strategic roads run through your property, no important rivers need defending, and no enemies have ever shown the slightest interest in conquering your turnip fields. It's the most peaceful place you've ever lived, and it's taken you months to stop feeling guilty about enjoying it. The farmhouse is modest but well built, constructed by the previous owner, who apparently shared your appreciation for solid stone walls and defensible positions. It's not a castle, but old habits die hard, and you found yourself automatically noting sight lines and potential approaches whenever you work in the garden. Jeffrey has stayed with you, transitioning from squire to farm manager with the same professional competence he brought to maintaining your armor. He's taken to agricultural life with surprising enthusiasm, developing opinions about crop rotation and livestock management that he pursues with the same attention to detail he once devoted to weapon maintenance. Your daily routine bears little resemblance to your years of knightly service. You wake with the sun, not because a bell is calling you to duty, but because the chickens have decided that dawn is feeding time, and chickens you've discovered are surprisingly tyrannical in their demands for punctual service. Your morning inspection covers the boundaries of your property rather than castle walls, but the underlying purpose is the same, ensuring that everything under your protection remains secure and functional. Instead of checking for signs of enemy activity, you look for breaks in fences, sick animals, and the kind of agricultural problems that can turn a successful harvest into an expensive disaster. The physical work is different from nightly training, but it's still demanding in its own way. Plowing fields may not require the same skills as mounted combat, but it provides its own form of conditioning. Your sword arm has been replaced by an equally strong plowing arm, and your balance in the saddle has been replaced by the ability to walk furrows that run straight and true across uneven ground. You've also discovered that farming requires many of the same strategic skills that made you a successful knight. Planning crop rotations is not unlike planning military campaigns. You need to consider weather, timing, resources, and potential problems while working toward long-term objectives that may not become apparent for months. The seasonal rhythm of agricultural life provides structure that's both familiar and different from your military career. Instead of campaigns and sieges, you have planting seasons and harvest times. Instead of enemy movements, you track weather patterns and market prices. Instead of battle preparations, you plan for winter storage and spring planting. Your neighbors are farmers, craftsmen, and merchants who treat you with a mixture of respect and curiosity. They're impressed by your knightly background, but more interested in your practical contributions to the local community. When wolves threaten livestock, they turn to you for leadership in organizing hunting parties. When disputes arise over boundary markers or water rights, they seek your judgment in settling matters that require someone with experience in making difficult decisions. You've become, in effect, an unofficial magistrate for the surrounding area, settling disputes and providing guidance based on decades of experience with the kind of problems that arise when people need to work together for mutual benefit. It's not so different from managing a castle garrison, except that instead of keeping soldiers focused on military objectives, you're helping farmers coordinate their efforts for agricultural success. The loneliness that you expected from retirement has been replaced by a different kind of social interaction. Your relationships with neighbors are based on mutual necessity and shared interests, rather than military hierarchy and professional obligation. You're valued for your experience and judgment, but you're also expected to contribute practical labor and technical skills. Evening entertainment consists of gatherings at the local inn where farmers and craftsmen discuss weather crops, local politics, and the occasional news from the wider world. Your stories of tournament competition and military service provide welcome variety to conversations that might otherwise focus exclusively on the relative merits of different fertilizing techniques. But you've discovered that your neighbors' stories are often more interesting than your own. The local blacksmith served with the King's army during the Scottish campaigns and has tales of battles that dwarf anything you experienced. The miller fought in France as a common soldier and survived engagements that killed half his company. The village priest was educated at Oxford and can discuss philosophy, theology, and politics with a sophistication that makes your own learning seem embarrassingly narrow. Retirement has given you perspective on your knightly career that was impossible to achieve while you were living it. The skills you developed, the experiences you accumulated, and the lessons you learned all have value, but they're not the only valuable things in the world. Your neighbors possess knowledge and abilities that complement your own, and your small community functions because everyone contributes according to their abilities and receives according to their needs. You've also had time to reflect on the nature of knighthood itself. The ideals you served, honor, courage, loyalty, protection of the innocent, remain valid, but they can be expressed in many ways that don't require armor and weapons. Helping a neighbor harvest his crop before bad weather ruins it is a form of service. Settling a dispute fairly is a form of justice. Training young men in the practical skills of self-defense is a form of protection. Your knightly vows didn't end when you stopped competing in tournaments. They evolved, adapting to circumstances that require different expressions of the same fundamental commitments. On quiet evenings when the day's work is done and you're sitting outside your farmhouse watching the sunset over fields you've planted and tended, you sometimes think about the path that brought you here. The years of training, the campaigns and sieges, the tournament circuit, and the gradual recognition that all careers, even the most adventurous ones, eventually come to an end. You've been fortunate. Many knights die young and battle victims of the violence they're trained to practice. Others live long enough to become bitter about opportunities they never had or achievements they never accomplished. Some spend their final years as pensioners in castles tolerated rather than valued, existing on the charity of lords who remember their service but no longer have use for their skills. You've managed to find a third path, retirement, that maintains dignity while providing genuine purpose. You're no longer a knight in active service, but you're still someone whose life has meaning and whose contributions matter to the people around you. It's not the ending you would have imagined when you first put on armor and dreamed of glory, but it's a good ending nonetheless. Perhaps the best lesson of a knightly career is that true success isn't measured by the height of your achievements, but by the grace with which you adapt when those achievements are no longer possible. The sun sets over your fields, and tomorrow there will be work to do. Practical, necessary work that serves people you care about in ways that matter. It's not knightly work in the traditional sense, but it's good work, and after a lifetime of service, that's enough. 10 years have passed since you hung up your sword for the last time, and tonight finds you sitting by your fireplace on a particularly cold winter evening, watching Geoffrey attempt to teach his grandson the finer points of sword maintenance. The boy, young Marcus, named for his grandfather who died in the French wars, holds your old practice sword with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious relics. The important thing, Geoffrey is saying, running a whetstone along the blade with practiced precision, is to understand that the sword is just a tool. It's the man holding it that matters. You smile at this, remembering similar conversations from your own youth, when such wisdom seemed far less obvious than it does now. Marcus nods with the solemn attention of a 10-year-old who's been told he's learning something important, though you suspect he's more interested in the sword than in philosophical discussions about the nature of warfare. The conversation drifts to other topics. The village's preparations for winter news from the wider world, brought by traveling merchants, and the inevitable gossip that sustains small communities through the long months when travel becomes difficult and entertainment scarce. But your thoughts keep returning to the question that's been occupying your mind more frequently as the years pass. What does it all mean? What's the purpose of a life spent learning to fight fighting, and then gradually transitioning away from fighting towards something that might charitably be called wisdom? Your knightly career, viewed from the perspective of a decade's retirement, seems both more and less significant than it did while you were living it. The individual battles, tournaments, and campaigns that once seemed so important have faded into a general impression of experience rather than specific memories of particular events. What remains is something less dramatic, but perhaps more valuable, an understanding of how people behave under pressure, how communities function in crisis, and how individual choices accumulate into larger consequences. The knights of popular imagination, the heroes of songs and stories, bear little resemblance to the reality you experienced. Real knighthood wasn't about glorious quests or romantic adventures. It was about doing a difficult job with professional competence while trying to maintain some semblance of honor in circumstances that often made honor seem like an expensive luxury. But perhaps that's exactly what made it valuable. Anyone can be honorable when honor costs nothing. The true test of character comes when doing the right thing requires sacrifice, risk, or simple endurance in the face of circumstances that would make compromise seem reasonable. You think about the siege that ended your first period of active service and how the decision to surrender came not from cowardice, but from practical recognition that further resistance would accomplish nothing except additional suffering. Honor sometimes requires admitting defeat, just as courage sometimes requires refusing to fight battles that can't be won. You think about the tournament circuit where you spent years performing violence for the entertainment of crowds who wanted to see their ideals of knighthood confirmed rather than examined. But even that artificial environment taught valuable lessons about the relationship between skill and spectacle, between authentic accomplishment and popular recognition. You think about your current life where the skills you developed as a knight find expression in helping neighbors solve problems that rarely involve weapons, but often require the same combination of judgment, leadership, and willingness to take responsibility that characterized your military service. Marcus Jeffrey's grandson has moved on from sword maintenance to questions about what it was really like to be a knight. His inquiries have the directness of youth. Did you kill people? Were you scared? What was the best part? What was the worst part? Jeffrey handles these questions with the diplomatic skill of someone who spent decades managing the gap between reality and expectation. Yes, knights sometimes had to kill people, but it wasn't the primary purpose of the job. Yes, everyone was scared sometimes, but courage meant doing what needed to be done despite the fear. The best part was the sense of purpose and the brotherhood of shared service. The worst part was the knowledge that even the best intentions sometimes led to terrible consequences. You find yourself adding details to Jeffrey's explanations, trying to provide a picture of knighthood that's honest without being discouraging, realistic without being cynical. Marcus listens with the kind of absorption that suggests he's already imagining himself in armor, though you suspect his version involves considerably more glory and considerably less mud than the reality would provide. As the evening progresses and young Marcus reluctantly heads home to his parents, you and Jeffrey settle into the comfortable silence of old friends who've shared enough experiences that conversation isn't always necessary. The fire crackles in the hearth, casting shifting shadows on the stone walls of your farmhouse, and for a moment you're reminded of countless similar evenings spent in castle halls, army camps, and tournament pavilions. Do you ever miss it? Jeffrey asks, breaking the silence with a question that's been implicit in your conversations for years but never directly addressed. You consider this carefully. Do you miss the weight of armor, the adrenaline of combat, the sense of purpose that came from clear military objectives? Do you miss the brotherhood of knights, the structured hierarchy of military service, the satisfaction of skills tested under ultimate pressure? I miss parts of it. You finally answer. I miss feeling like what I was doing mattered in an immediate, obvious way. I miss the clarity of purpose that comes from having defined enemies and clear objectives. I miss the companionship of people who understand the same challenges and share the same risks. You pause watching the flames dance in the fireplace. But I don't miss the fear, the uncertainty, or the knowledge that every day might be your last. I don't miss watching friends die for causes that seemed important at the time, but now seem like footnotes in someone else's history. And I definitely don't miss sleeping in armor because you can't risk being caught unprepared. Jeffrey nods with the understanding of someone who shared those experiences and reached similar conclusions. The young ones, he says, gesturing toward the door through which Marcus recently departed, they see the adventure and the glory. They don't see the parts we remember most clearly. This is probably true. Memory has a way of editing experience, emphasizing the dramatic moments while quietly discarding the long periods of discomfort, boredom, and simple endurance that made up the majority of knightly service. The stories you tell about your career naturally focus on the interesting parts, the battles, the tournaments, the moments of triumph and disaster that make for compelling narratives. What you don't usually mention is the way your back ached after hours in the saddle, the constant worry about money and employment, the political complexities that turned allies into enemies and enemies into allies with bewildering frequency. You don't talk about the friends who died not in glorious battle, but from infected wounds, disease, or simple accidents that claimed lives just as surely as enemy weapons. You don't discuss the moral ambiguities that arose when your lord's interests conflicted with what seemed right, or the compromises you made in service to practical necessities that had little to do with the ideals of chivalry. These aspects of knightly life are less suitable for fireside stories, but they were often more significant than the dramatic moments that make for better entertainment. The fire burns lower, and you add another log, watching sparks spiral up the chimney into the winter night. Outside snow is beginning to fall, the first serious snowfall of the season that will isolate your small community until spring makes travel practical again. It's a kind of siege, but one you're prepared for and can survive comfortably. What would you tell him, Jeffrey asks, and you know he's referring to Marcus. If he were old enough to understand, what would you want him to know about what we did? It's a question that deserves a thoughtful answer because it goes to the heart of what you've learned from a lifetime of service. What wisdom, if any, have you accumulated that might be useful to someone just beginning to consider his place in the world? I'd tell him that honor isn't about grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. You say slowly, it's about making the right choice when nobody's watching, and when doing the right thing costs you something you'd rather keep. I'd tell him that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act properly despite fear. You shift in your chair, old joints protesting the cold. I'd tell him that the most important battles aren't the ones that get remembered in songs, but the small daily fights between what's easy and what's right. And I'd tell him that the true measure of a man's worth isn't what he accomplishes when he's young and strong, but what he becomes when age forces him to find new ways to serve. Jeffrey considers this, then adds his own perspective. I'd tell him that loyalty is important, but it has to be earned by both sides. That following orders is necessary, but following them blindly is dangerous. And that the best leaders are the ones who understand the difference between authority and power. These are hard-won insights paid for with years of service under lords both worthy and unworthy in causes both just and questionable. They're not the kind of lessons that young men eager for adventure want to hear, but they're the lessons that determine whether a career in service leads to honor or regret. The snow continues to fall outside, and you realize that this winter conversation represents something of a milestone. You're no longer simply a retired knight trying to adjust to civilian life. You've become something else, an elder, a repository of experience, someone whose value lies not in what he can do, but in what he knows. It's a role you never expected to play, but one that feels appropriate. The physical strength that defined your early career has given way to the kind of wisdom that only comes from surviving long enough to see the long-term consequences of short-term decisions. The immediacy of combat has been replaced by the longer perspective that recognizes patterns and understands how individual actions fit into larger stories. Young Marcus, will make his own choices about what kind of life he wants to live and what kind of man he wants to become. He may choose knighthood, or he may find other ways to serve. But when he does make those choices, he'll do so with the benefit of honest accounts from people who've walked similar paths and can provide guidance based on real experience rather than romantic idealization. That may be the most valuable service you can provide in your retirement, serving as a bridge between the ideals that inspire young people and the realities they'll face when they try to live according to those ideals. It's not as dramatic as leading a cavalry charge or winning a tournament, but it's important work nonetheless. The fire burns down to embers, and you and Jeffrey make your preparations for bed. Tomorrow, there will be the usual winter tasks, checking on the animals, maintaining equipment, and ensuring that everything remains secure and functional despite the weather. It's peaceful work, but it's work nonetheless, and it provides the same satisfaction that came from military service, the knowledge that you're doing something necessary and doing it well. As you settle into bed, listening to the wind drive snow against your windows, you reflect on the strange trajectory that brought you from a young man eager for glory to an old man content with simple competence. It wasn't the path you would have chosen when you first put on armor, but it's proven to be a good path nonetheless. The snow falls quietly outside, adding another layer to the accumulation that will protect your fields through the winter and provide the moisture they'll need for next year's crops. It's a natural process that requires no human intervention, but one that makes human flourishing possible. Perhaps that's an appropriate metaphor for a life well lived, providing the foundation that allows others to grow and prosper, even when your own season of active growth has passed. Sleep comes easily these days, untroubled by the hypervigilance that characterized your military years or the anxiety about performance that marked your tournament career. You found peace with your choices, your accomplishments, and your limitations. It's a peace that was hard-earned and well-deserved, and it serves as a fitting conclusion to a life spent in service to ideals that may have been imperfect, but were never worthless. In your dreams, you sometimes return to the castle courtyards and tournament fields of your youth, but these dreams aren't tinged with regret or longing. They're simply memories preserved and treasured, but no longer defining. You've learned the most important lesson of any warrior's career, that knowing when to put down your sword is just as important as knowing how to use it. The snow continues to fall through the night, blanketing the countryside in quiet white that will persist until spring returns and the cycle begins again. And perhaps that's the real lesson of knighthood, that everything has its season and wisdom lies in understanding what season you're in and living accordingly. Your season of active service has passed, but your season of reflection and guidance has begun. It's a different kind of service, but it's service nonetheless, and it has its own rewards and satisfactions. The boy who dreamed of glory has become the man who understands that true accomplishment often comes in forms that would have disappointed his younger self, but satisfy his older one completely. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's everything. Years pass as they do, with the steady inevitability of seasons changing and generations turning. Your story becomes one of many that shape the small corner of the world where you chose to finish your days. The farm prospers. Your neighbors remember you with respect and affection, and young Marcus grows into a man who chooses his own path with the benefit of honest guidance from someone who walked a similar road. History, the formal kind that gets written in books and preserved in monasteries, barely notices your existence. You were never important enough to warrant mention in chronicles of kings and kingdoms. No songs are sung about your exploits. No legends grow around your name. You lived, you served, you fought when necessary, and farmed when possible, and you died peacefully in your bed, surrounded by people who valued your life and mourned your passing. But perhaps that's the most honest ending for any story about knighthood. The vast majority of knights lived similar lives, careers of service that combined duty with hardship, honor with compromise, and idealism with practical necessity. They weren't heroes of romance or villains of tragedy. They were professionals doing a difficult job in complicated times, trying to maintain their integrity while serving causes that were sometimes worthy and sometimes questionable. The real history of knighthood isn't found in the tales of Arthur and his round table, but in the accumulated experiences of thousands of men who put on armor, served their lords, protected their communities, and gradually grew old enough to understand that glory was less important than simple competence, and that the true measure of a life wasn't what you accomplished in your prime, but what you became in your decline. Your story ends, as most stories do, not with fanfare or dramatic conclusion, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life lived according to principles that proved more durable than the circumstances that tested them. You were a knight, and when knighthood was no longer possible, you became something else. But you never stopped being someone whose life had meaning and whose choices mattered to the people around you. And in the end, that's enough. That's everything. The soft snow continues to fall outside, covering the fields where tomorrow's stories will grow, and the fire burns low in hearths across the land, where other veterans of other wars settle into sleep, carrying their own memories of armor and weapons, brotherhood and lost service and sacrifice. The age of knights continues, as it always has, not in the grand gestures of legend, but in the quiet determination of people who choose to serve something larger than themselves, whatever form that service might take. And so, the wheel turns, and the story continues, and somewhere a young person looks at a sword and wonders what it would be like to carry it in service of ideals that seem both impossible and necessary. The answer, as always, is that it would be exactly as difficult and exactly as worthwhile as everything else worth doing in a world that offers no easy choices but demands that choices be made nonetheless. Sleep well, old knight. Your watch is ended, and others will take up the burden. But they will do so with the benefit of your example, and that may be the most valuable service of all.